Nicol Bolas, arguably Magic's most iconic big bad and one of the greatest threats that the multiverse has ever known. He was an elder dragon with total mastery over black, red, and blue mana, who had forgotten more about magic than any other person would ever learn. His slightest touch shattered the minds of others who would be twisted and manipulated into falling in line before him. He was the Forever Serpent, the Second Son, the God Pharaoh. But before this would-be conqueror of the multiverse was any of these things, he was merely a half-sized dragon named Nicol. Around 25,000 years ago on Dominaria, the Ur-dragon flew through the sky and shed countless stone eggs from its wings, which came crashing down to the planet like meteors. And in this way, dragons would find life on the plane. Almost every single egg contained a dragon within it, with the exception of one. One egg was special and housed two dragons who would emerge together, albeit half the size of their siblings. These two would touch Dominaria's soil together. They'd decide on their names together. And almost immediately, they would witness the death of their sister, Marevia Sol, together. A very quick lesson that no creature was truly safe in this world, not even dragons. The brothers were Nicol and Ugin, and after witnessing Marevia's execution at the hands of humanity, their paths forward were set in stone. Nicol was filled with rage because of the fear that this moment instilled in him, a fear that he hated and rejected with every part of himself, and so he wanted to retaliate to prove that this fear wasn't real. Ugin, on the other hand, convinced him that this was too dangerous, thinking that they should instead protect themselves, seek out knowledge, and find their siblings, and then find a path forward. And so the two of them would take flight together to see this new world that they were born into. A sky that stretched to the ends of the world, dotted with clouds like mist that floated over rivers and vast lands filled with life. But again, the brothers saw things differently. Ugin took all of this in and was consumed by wonder, a passion to learn, to discover, and to understand everything that he could. But Nicol looked across this beautiful landscape and only wondered how he could have saved his sister. To him, this wasn't a world of infinite possibilities, it was a world of hunters and the hunted. He didn't care about the knowledge he could gather, only the power that he could sum up to ensure that humanity never lost their fear of dragons, now that they were sure that they could be killed. These thoughts in mind, Nicol would look into the sky and see a ball of golden fire that soared above all else. A source of power with no equal that he would spend the rest of his life trying to emulate. More than anything, he wanted to become a second son that ruled above all. Soon, the brothers found their way to one of their siblings, Chromium Rule. Chromium saw himself above the twins. He was twice their size, he knew his place, and despite being born just barely before them, he understood the world already. Just by looking at Nicol and Ugin, he could see that unlike the other dragons who had two names, each of these twins had taken one half of theirs. There was no Nicol Ugin, and instead there was Nicol and Ugin. And this somehow meant that neither of them could ever stack up to the great Chromium Rule or any of their other siblings for that matter. This idea upset Nicol greatly, as he never wanted to be seen as lesser than anyone. Soon the twins would find their way to their next sibling, Palladia Mors. Chromium had suggested that she could teach them how to hunt, however, she too judged the brothers. She scoffed at the idea of them hunting because of their size. Palladia saw them as so weak that she had left behind a beast that she had hunted and flown away. And while Ugin was quick to try this meal, Nicol insisted on never eating someone else's scraps. He would hunt his own meal. However, he didn't want to go alone. Neither of them had ever been apart from each other. They had never taken a step without the other, or spread their wings and flown out of earshot. And so, when it came to hunting, the twins would do this together as well. Palladia Mors was a dragon that knew only hunting, but the twins could think of so much more. In fact, Nicol would even reflect on the hunters who had killed their sister and recalled that they had attacked in groups. And so he suggested that they too use teamwork to hunt. He and Ugin might not have been the size of their siblings, but they also differed in another way. Every other dragon was alone, and they had each other. The next sibling that they came across was Arcades Sabbath, who lived in the Great Ring Wall. This dragon was attended to by humanity. They seemed to worship him, something which surprised Nicol. However, as the twins approached the humans, they began to panic. Horns blared, arrows flew towards them, and Nicol was wounded. Not enough to seriously harm him, but he had been wounded all the same. His fear once again took over and Nicol retaliated. He breathed flames that scorched the towers and the walls, killing dozens. And it was then that Arcades would attack the young dragon, slamming into him and sending him flying. Ugin managed to take his brother away, but Arcades followed soon afterwards. When he landed, Ugin apologized, saying that he assumed the humans were used to dragons as they worshipped Arcades, but Arcades explained that not all dragons are the same, and even those who worshipped him knew they needed to be cautious. Again, Nicol didn't want himself to be seen as lesser than their older sibling, and so in the face of Arcades, he would don a second name as he approached his great brother, and from this moment on, he would be known as Nicol Bolas. Bolas asked Arcades how he could live amongst humanity knowing that they had attacked dragons, even killing one of their sisters. However, Arcades had a different view on things. He said that humanity had just as much a right to live as dragons did, but unlike dragons, they worked together, something that he wished to show the twins so long as they could follow the rules of his colony. Bolas and Ugin would live here for years as humanity continued to spread around them. Walls built around an ever-expanding territory, babies seemingly born by the minute and starting new lives which would prosper into entire families. Homes sprouting as far as the eye could see like trees growing in a forest. And it wasn't just this city. Trade envoys flowed in and out like the tide, a symbol of other nations beyond the horizon which were growing themselves. And despite how much hatred Bolas had for humanity when he arrived here, he fully immersed himself in their ways. However, each of the dragons present had a different goal for humanity. Arcades wanted to guide them to peace. Ugin sought to learn from them, but Bolas wanted something else. He had found a new way to avenge his sister. He discovered that humanity had troubles. These beings held emotions deep within themselves for years, an ever-growing powder keg that a simple spark could set off at any moment. And so he began to play with this idea and tested his theories. Using his mind-shattering touch, Bolas would convince a good man to stab his brother by playing them against one another. It was only a small action. He had made one human act in his favor, but now was the time to flex these new manipulative muscles and see how far they could really take him. And so Bolas flew off to take his revenge, and as he did, Ugin would follow for fear of what his brother might be capable of. Bolas had flown to the peaks of a mountain overlooking the tribe which had hunted his sister all those years ago, and what he found was that she was not alone in being hunted. Several dragons had their skulls adorning the village gates. This vile group of humans had developed weapons, armors, and even magic as they continued to grow their population. And with this ever-expanding force, they had continued to slay Bolas's siblings. As morning broke, Bolas and Ugin were approached by their brother Chromium. However, the great dragon had taken the form of a human so that he was able to walk among them. He explained to Bolas that while he lived there, he learned that humanity wore their expressions like clothing. They could cast emotions on or off at a whim to meet whatever circumstance might benefit them most. But that wasn't their only form of wickedness. Apparently, the chief of this tribe believed that he had divine favor from having killed a dragon in the past, and because of this, he believed all others to be below him, and even saw many of them as slaves. Hearing this, Bolas simply laughed. In the moment, he thought that he would be disgusted by it, but instead, he was inspired. Strength and ingenuity were enough to stand atop the weak here. These humans were not like those who lived under Arcades. Instead, their worldview was much more akin to his own. Chromium wished to punish these dragon killers by raining fire down on them, but Bolas had a more twisted vision, one that was inspired by humanity themselves. Sure, they could kill a small group of them, but humanity would still endure, even without this tribe. But instead, they could turn humanity on themselves. Chromium was angered at Bolas twisting his thoughts and words to fit his own ideals, and so he flew off to seek Arcades' advice. But when he did, Bolas and Ugin made their way down the mountain to meet with humanity. Bolas would use his magic to manipulate the leaders of these human tribes, sowing seeds of doubt, insecurity, and envy, which over time would grow and fester. He would explain to Ugin that humanity would easily do their bidding. They only had to learn where to stick their claw to get the response they wanted. And in Bolas's case, he would always get what he wanted. One chief's son would march into his father's garrison and kill him before installing himself on the throne. Another 2 factions would climb Bolas's mountain to try and eliminate the dragons after he provoked them, but this was part of his plan. He would trap them, surround them in a sea of lava, and force them to fight to ensure their own survival. And while their soldiers fought on the mountainside, Bolas would fly to their unguarded temples and burn their religious leaders to ash. One by one, Bolas would remove pillars of power, leadership, and magic from these tribes, turning them against each other and whispering their deepest insecurity into their minds to ensure that things fell into place as he wanted them to. Ugin, of course, knew nothing of what was happening. To him, suddenly these humans were irrationally violent and began slaughtering each other in a way that he had never seen in the past. But then his brother approached him, and just as every time in the past, he expected his brother to follow. "Come witness the end, Ugin," he said. "Come witness the beginning." There would be one final act of treachery. The only 2 remaining heirs of the Dragon Slayers were meant to be married in the morning, and so these were the last of the divinely chosen chiefs. Each heir held a claw from the dragon that their ancestors had slain, and while these were meant to be symbols of the strength of their bloodlines, Bolas would make them each stab each other in the heart with these claws, all before he finally revealed himself to humanity and demanded that they bow before their new ruler. Bolas had attained his revenge. But more importantly, he had experienced the pleasure of conquest, of dominating those below him and demonstrating his own genius. And so he wouldn't just be satisfied ruling over a few tribes. In this moment, he would look at the horizon and decide that all of Dominaria would have to fall before him. Bolas would turn to his twin and try to convince him to join him in this effort. With their magic, they could easily rule this plane uncontested. Not even their siblings could stand against them. He would even go so far as to try to use his mind-warping magic on his brother to ensure their allegiance. However, for the first time in his life, this failed. Possibly because these 2 shared one spirit, Ugin was able to resist his brother's magic. Not only that, but in seeing his brother try to take control of him, Ugin realized that he was nothing more than a plaything to Bolas. They were not equals, they were not partners. Ugin was just a tool that could be used for his brother to achieve his own goals. And with that realization, his heart broke. He was so crushed by this reality that something inside of him ignited like a spark. For a moment, his entire body and mind turned against itself. His lungs felt as heavy as lead. His flesh felt like it was being turned inside out, and a storm of wind whirled within his thoughts. But as it all began to overwhelm him, a flash of nothingness freed him. His mind went blank. He was unfeeling and unseeing. And when he finally regained his senses, he was no longer on Dominaria. He found himself over a vast ocean, staring at his reflection in the water. Ugin had become what is likely the first planeswalker in history. But in doing so, he had left Dominaria, and by extension, left his brother unchecked. And so Bolas was free to fully explore his thirst for conquest as Dominaria's second son. Before we continue though, real quick, a huge thank you to our Patreon, where members like Queso, Laetus, and Casino are helping to make videos like this possible. Check out the link in the description if you're looking to support the channel, and of course, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more content like this. Okay, back to the video. And so began the Elder Dragon War. Despite what you might imagine, Bolas was a just and fair ruler whose reign brought order, peace, and a legend of dishonorable dragon hunters who once ruled but were executed for reaching beyond their station. But dragons are bred from envy, and the longer that he ruled, the more dragons were born outside of his kingdom. Eventually, they swarmed together, and many of them raided his domain. He would try to fend them off, however, as magnificent as he was, even he could not defeat a horde alone. But he wasn't alone. His subjects fought with him. Proud warriors and powerful sorcerers who would battle alongside him. With these forces in tow, it was a slaughter. All but one of the invading dragons were killed, and for the first time since he had become king, Bolas felt something intoxicating. But this was on a level he had never experienced before. What a sensation it was to dominate not just those lesser beings like humanity, but even the great and powerful dragons. It fulfilled him so deeply that even seeing that final dragon soar away flooded Bolas with bloodlust, and he ordered his soldiers to hunt them down. They chased the dragon back to the lair of Bolas's most aggressive and monstrous cousin, Vivictus Asmondi. And here they found his 3 brothers, Lividus, Ravis, and Rubra, all of whom insulted Bolas, calling him runt and demanding that he flee if he wanted to live. But Bolas was not that fledgling quick to anger that he was all those years ago, at least not publicly. In private, he would behead several of his generals who had allowed the dragon to escape, but this rage was quickly focused. He promoted new soldiers, reorganized his army, and created a force much stronger than what had stood before. Slowly, Bolas's army took control of the fight, but then an idea crossed the king's mind. He thought back to using his magic on Ugin, how his corruption had failed to influence his brother. But what if it was not his spell that failed, but his brother who had been special? They shared the same blood after all. Ugin must have some potential for greatness. And so, when Vivictus sent Lividus ahead of his brothers, Bolas called to him. He saw the dragon's insecurity and asked his cousin how awful it must be for Vivictus to always send him and his siblings ahead to fight his battles for him, to risk their lives while he sit in safety. And for just a moment, Lividus hesitated, and that's all that Bolas needed to know that he had won. He continued to press and twist his deceitful words until Lividus turned to attack his own ally in Bolas' stead. Still a pawn, but for a new king. This wouldn't be enough to stop Vivictus, though. So while he was distracted, Bolas fled to Palladia Mors to make her aware of their chance to defeat this great cousin of theirs. And again, Bolas was amazed at how easily he could manipulate those around him. Even the mighty Chromium and the wise Arcades would be dragged into this plane-wide war, but in the end it was Bolas who emerged victorious, with only Arcades left standing between him and his true supreme reign. The great dragons battled, and Bolas had nearly forced Arcades to retreat, but then Ugin returned and stopped the fight. Bolas had thought that his brother had been killed by some spell all those years ago, but suddenly, here he was. While Bolas couldn't believe it at first, he soon realized that his brother had actually returned, and so he would allow Arcades to flee and take Ugin on a tour of Dominaria as he boasted the whole way. At the core of his being, Bolas believed that Ugin had become jealous of him for outgrowing all the judgment of their siblings. However, Ugin instead saw all of this as insignificant. Here, his brother was talking about the smallest corners and the greatest plains of this world as though they were something special. But Ugin had spent all this time seeing just how great and vast the universe truly was. How many other worlds there were. How small Dominaria was in comparison. And in finding out that there was so much more than this tiny slice of reality, suddenly even Bolas's hard-fought victory was not enough. His brother was looking down on him for his limited scope of the world, and he wouldn't have it. But as he turned to scold Ugin, he found nothing. His brother was gone again. Bolas, the dragon who claimed himself to be the second sun, the light of the world, bringing in an age of warmth, for the first time felt cold, abandoned. His brother had arrived just to flaunt magic that he would not share, just to insult his life's work, just to leave once again like Bolas didn't matter at all. That coldness quickly turned into rage, and that rage ignited a spark deep within the great dragon, and suddenly he was no longer on Dominaria. Like his brother, Bolas was a planeswalker. He would travel to hundreds of planes in search of others with this ability, but no matter how many he visited, he found nothing. But suddenly he understood what Ugin had meant, and he began to search for his brother instead so that they could share this glory with each other. However, he couldn't find his brother, and after countless years passed, he returned to Dominaria. By the time he arrived, everything had changed. The courses of rivers had altered, islands had sunk below the sea, lakes had run dry. It was a whole new world, and the only remnants of the plane he had once ruled were the other Elder Dragons, Chromium Rule, Arcades Sabbath, Palladium Ors, and Vivictus Asmondi. Bolas went to speak to Arcades, who boasted of the vastness of his empire in Bolas's absence, a scene that was pretty similar to Bolas bragging to Ugin the last time they were on Dominaria. And like his brother, Bolas now knew just how small this world was. But even so, there was nothing that Bolas loved more than manipulating others, and so as he heard Arcades talk about how much of a greater ruler he had become than Bolas ever was, Bolas would lean in and whisper a seed of doubt into his brother's mind. Sure, he had built this kingdom full of humans, but what if they were simply biding their time? What if these humans continued to spread until their numbers could overwhelm him? Bolas suggested that he send agents to every corner of Dominaria to investigate his subjects just to be safe. He could even offer rewards for turning in traitors and handsomely pay those who betrayed their own kin. And if all else failed, he could always burn down entire cities that might oppose him. These ideas would become a cancer in Arcades' mind, which would always remain to needle at the back of his thoughts no matter how much time had passed. Now that he was infected by Bolas's poisoned words, the planeswalker could leave Dominaria with a smile, knowing it was only a matter of time until this great kingdom fell. Bolas then traveled to a plane he called the Meditation Realm, and here he finally found Ugin. But his brother had changed. He had realized that Bolas was a plague that would contaminate the multiverse, and as such he needed to be stopped, and so they began to fight. The battle would go on for days, years, even generations, as they plummeted through plane after plane until they traveled full circle back to the Meditation Realm, and here Bolas would ultimately take his brother's life. Ugin would fall and crash into the waters below them. The ocean's waves became furious and seemed to never end, extending beyond the Meditation Realm itself and into the blind eternities, and as a result, Bolas would be flung as well through nearly 100 planes before he landed back on Dominaria on the island of Madara. Eventually, Bolas would return to the Meditation Realm, where he found the Spirit Gem. He didn't quite know what it was, but it clearly had a strong tie to this realm, so he would wear it between his horns as a symbol of his supremacy. Back on Madara, Bolas would live on until a demonic planeswalking Leviathan appeared, the first other creature that he had come across that could jump between planes other than himself or Ugin. Ultimately, the dragon and the Leviathan battled for an entire month and destroyed nearly 2/3 of Madara. However, from this destruction came creation, and the first temporal rift was opened. Bolas would feast on the defeated Leviathan for an entire year, leaving only a few bones behind which would form the Talon Gates of Madara. This would be his ultimate trophy to relish in his victory. But he would gain more than just something to look at. By feeding on the Leviathan, Bolas would gain its strength and become more powerful than he had ever been. As time continued to pass, Bolas would begin to look away from Dominaria. He had already dominated this plane, and now that he knew that there was so much more laying in wait for him, he would start his ultimate conquest of the multiverse. Wherever he went, Bolas would sow discourse and leave nothing but destruction in his wake. Optimistically, he would gain knowledge and insight from these new worlds, but even if he couldn't, he would at least be able to show off his incredible power by bringing them to ruin. This wandering of the multiverse would continue for thousands of years. But while he was away, the brothers' war between Urza and Mishra would result in the creation of the Shard of 12 Worlds, an interconnected set of planes which were sealed off by an aura that would prevent planeswalking into or out of them. And as a result, he could no longer return to Dominaria. And so, Bolas would wait. He'd continue to gather more information, gain more power, and create great civilizations which worshipped him as though he were a god, while at the same time wiping out any who opposed him or refused to bend their knee. In opposition to this spread of chaos was a being of order, Ravnica's planeswalking Perun, the Sphinx Azor. While the two would never actually fight directly, they did compete to spread their influence over several planes, until eventually Azor feared what Bolas would do so much that he made a plan to imprison him forever. However, the Sphinx wouldn't be alone in this mission, as Ugin would work alongside him.
Didn't you just talk about how Bolas killed Ugin? It was a whole thing?
Yeah, I did. But anyways.
No. Explain.
Alright. So basically, after Bolas killed him, Ugin was launched into the ocean of the meditation realm. But the lives of planeswalkers in this era were tied to their soul more so than their physical bodies. So his spirit was able to manifest into a body made of that realm's water, taking on a new life as the spirit dragon and vowing to protect the multiverse from threats like his brother, who might bring ruin to entire planes. We are dealing with a story about magic reality jumping dragons here. A resurrection once in a while is just gonna happen. We can't stop every time it does. So anyways, Ugin and the Sphinx would use Azor's spark to create and fuel an artifact called the Immortal Sun. Once Bolas was bound within, Ugin would be able to remove him from existence. The plan was for Azor to sit in waiting on Ixalan while Ugin lured Bolas to Tarkir, eventually leading him back towards Azor, who would activate the Immortal Sun and trap Bolas indefinitely. However, Bolas was clever. He picked up on traces of Azor on planes which used to belong to him that Bolas was now conquering. Not only that, but he learned of Ugin's resurrection. As for Tarkir, this was a plane that was deeply tied to Ugin. Millennia ago, while his brother believed he was dead after first awakening as a planeswalker, Ugin shaped Tarkir into his own image, allowing it to develop and prosper for all of this time. It was Ugin's pride and joy, and it was the perfect target for Bolas to corrupt in order to hurt his brother. So, Bolas would travel to Tarkir while remaining hidden from his brother. Here, he found dragons being born from maelstroms created from Ugin's own energy. His brother had been creating an army to overwhelm Bolas the moment he arrived on this plane, but Bolas had his own secret weapon. He had found a willing pawn in the Khan of a Temur, that being Yasova Dragonclaw. He fed her false visions of a future where Tarkir was free of dragons, a time where the Temur would no longer need to live in fear of the beasts and could instead rule the plane themselves. Bolas explained to her that he only wanted to destroy his brother and his hordes of dragons, but he needed her power to do that. You see, Yasova had the ability to manipulate wild beasts, and with her at his side, he could challenge his brother without fear of losing. Bolas would emerge from hiding and challenge his brother to a fight, a conflict so great that it was a miracle the plane survived at all. But just as before, Bolas held the advantage. Pushed back into a corner, Ugin would reveal his trump card by unleashing a deafening roar which summoned all of Tarkir's dragons to him so that they could assist in killing his brother. While Ugin had an army, Bolas only needed Yasova. With all of these dragons gathered and ready to attack, Yasova sent out a command to the minds of each of them, simply saying to kill Ugin. His creations would turn against him and left Ugin vulnerable, and using this opening, Bolas would attack one final time, sending his brother plummeting, crashing into the ground and leaving behind a massive chasm. Once again, Bolas had defeated his twin. Even so, he was unsure that his brother would remain dead this time. So, 18 years later, he would return to examine the area, and here he found hedrons on his brother's grave, though he couldn't really find any significance to them. What he did find was Yasova and her granddaughter Naiva. Curious as to why they might be here, he offered to give Naiva the reins to Tarkir if she ratted out her grandmother. But before this could play out, Yasova convinced Bolas that the site was being targeted by the Immortal Sun in an attempt to trap him. This was enough to scare the dragon away. Luckily for him, the Shard of 12 Worlds had been shattered, and he could finally return home to Dominaria. Well, sort of. The Time Rift, which had been left behind by the Leviathan, had tied itself to him, and as a result, he could no longer physically manifest on Dominaria without the risk of overwhelming and destroying the plane. To circumvent this, he would anchor himself to the plane's mana lines. He found a point on Madara where the black, blue, and red mana veins intersected and used it as a focus. Once he arrived on the plane safely, he found a world which had long forgotten his rule yet again. He had become a legend lost to time on Dominaria, but he would correct this problem immediately. He killed the Empress of Madara, took her place, and built an imperial shrine where the mana lines met so that he could rule for the next 400 years as the God Emperor of Madara. Here, Bolas would inadvertently create his own worst enemy. As God Emperor, Bolas often passed on day-to-day affairs to his chosen elites, such as the assassin Ramses Overdark, who was a regent, or the imperial champion Tetsuo Umezawa from Kamigawa. Tetsuo was a nearly unrivaled master of blue, red, and black mana, as well as physical combat, and using these skills, he wished to protect his people from this new emperor. And so he would create a plan. He trained in the meditation realm, learning all of its secrets and how best to manipulate it to his advantage. And once he felt he was ready, he killed Ramses and absorbed his power so that he could use it against Bolas himself. Seeing one of his own betray him, Bolas allowed his rage to take over for the first time in millennia. His spirit would leave his body to chase Tetsuo into the meditation realm, but in doing so, he made the greatest mistake of his life. In leaving his body within the Imperial Shrine, Bolas was unprotected. This created an opportunity for Tetsuo to cast the Meteor Hammer spell and completely destroy the shrine and sever Bolas' tie to the mana of Dominaria. For the first time in his life, Bolas was powerless. No magic, no plans, no sneak attack, and under these conditions, it would be only a matter of time until he was ultimately defeated and killed at the hands of a mere mortal. But Bolas' story does not end there. Due to his connection to the temporal rift, his spirit continued to roam the Madaran coast. He would be trapped between the material and meditation realm for nearly 1,000 years. Throughout this time, the rift continued to expand, and eventually it had grown enough for him to manifest into Madara once again, even if only as a shade. He adopted the alias Sensei Ryu and used it to continue manipulating others from behind the scenes until eventually Venser arrived on the shores of Madara. Venser had a mutated Planespark, which Bolas took a particular interest in. And so he'd take hold of Venser's mind and use the Planeswalker's ability to bring him back into the material world by pulling a copy of his body from another point in time through the rift. I cannot stress how much Planeswalkers used to be like gods and could just do whatever they wanted before the mending happened. But Venser was not alone though, and Jhoira managed to buy time until Teferi emerged from the time rift as well and challenged the dragon to a duel. However, no matter what Teferi tried, Bolas simply absorbed all of his attacks, planeswalked away, or avoided them. And ultimately, Bolas would end the fight with his mind-shattering touch before ripping Teferi apart, which the mage survived. As the dragon held his head between his claws, Teferi explained that the stream of time was being distorted as a result of the rift, and reality was being pulled apart at the seams as a result. At this rate, it was just a matter of time until the entirety of Dominaria collapsed in on itself. And this is actually why Teferi, Venser, Radha, and Jhoira were here in the first place. Luckily, Bolas understood how serious this issue was and would allow Teferi to heal himself so that he could continue to deal with the time rift. This man really meant nothing to him anyways. What he really wanted was revenge against the man who had killed him. And so he would leave Teferi and Venser to hunt down anyone related to Tetsuo Umezawa or those who had helped him in any way, a quest which would bring him to Kamigawa. Here, Bolas would attack the Hunden of Night's Reach and cripples the Myojin as she was the one who had sent Tetsuo to Dominaria and set Bolas' downfall into motion. Once he was satisfied with his assault, Bolas returned to Dominaria where he is ambushed by yet another planeswalker, Leshrac. Leshrac was planning to kill Bolas so that he could steal his power and become the strongest being in the multiverse. He had even gone so far as to approach the Myojin of Night's Reach before Bolas had killed them and taken their mask. With this tool at his disposal, Leshrac manipulated Jeska into helping him battle Bolas. But in the end, he would strip her of Phage's power and fight the Elder Dragon himself. With Phage's magic, Leshrac continued to attack Bolas, paralyzing him and stripping the flesh from his bones throughout the battle. As they fought, they shifted from plane to plane, Ravnica, Kamigawa, Mercadia, Ulgrowth, and in each location, strips of Bolas were rotted off and left behind. Eventually, they found their way back to Dominaria, and Leshrac readies a spell to kill the dragon, but in the last instant, Bolas turned the tables. His now skeletal tail impaled his enemy, and he explained that while Leshrac had a mask from Night's Reach, it was just an imitation. Bolas had secured the true mask when he killed the Myojin, and the real deal was infinitely more powerful. Hearing those words, Leshrac was filled with fear as he watched Bolas's body instantly rebuild itself in front of him. The dragon then used the true Mask of Night's Reach to steal Leshrac away effortlessly and end the battle all at once. However, Leshrac would not stay sealed away for long. The Madaran Time Rift was still open, and Bolas would expend all of his defeated foe's power to seal it, killing Leshrac in the process. From here, the dragon returned to Teferi's group and explained that he had sealed the rift, but it was not the only one, and even despite his efforts, the rest of the multiverse was still collapsing in on itself. But that simply wasn't Bolas's problem. He believed that even if the multiverse did destroy itself, he still had a way to survive, and so he left the other planeswalkers to their duty and traveled to Amonkhet rather than helping them. On Amonkhet, Bolas took a particular interest in a metal called Lazotep, which reacted to necromancy. However, he was not warmly welcomed onto the plane. The gods of this world challenged him and worked together to fend off the invader, but as Bolas rampaged through their lands, he laid waste to their population, and with less worshippers, the gods' power began to wane, and ultimately they were forced back to the town of Noctimoon. As he broke through their barriers, Bolas would cast a spell which killed every adult on the plane so that none could remember a time before his rule. Not only that, but true to his nature, Bolas would use his magic to mentally warp and dominate the local gods and angels into subservience. Just like that, he had seized control, but it wasn't enough. He had taken over Dominaria in the past, but after leaving the plane, he returned to a world which had forgotten him, and so Amonkhet would be different. He summoned the mummified dead of the plane to raise the children that he had orphaned. He erected monuments dedicated to his own greatness. The newly corrupted angels of the plane would serve as agents to keep watch in his absence, and most importantly, he produced legends of how he created Amonkhet and a prophecy about his glorious return. He would then test the populace, including their previous gods, promising those who passed a true afterlife, while all others would be left to the horrors of the Broken Lands. And all of this would be written down in the accounting of hours. Everything was progressing easily, but suddenly Bolas hit a snag. To the dragon's surprise, back on Dominaria, Jessica had managed to save the multiverse through a great mending, which healed all the damage from the time rifts and sealed them shut. However, the universe would need to find a new way to balance itself, and it did this through changing planeswalker sparks. As a result, all existing planeswalkers, Bolas included, would lose their immortality and a huge portion of their magical abilities. Even so, Bolas was still a great elder dragon with tens of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, so he was far from powerless, yet at the same time, he was still a shadow of his former self. Everything he did going forward would reflect this desire to become whole again, to regain the power he spent his entire life accumulating that ensured no one could ever look down on him in the same way his siblings had after he had been hatched half a dragon. And so if it meant finding a path towards regaining his greatness, Bolas would take over the entire multiverse. To this end, he began planting seeds on several planes. Thoughts, ideas, agents, anything that he could do to spread his influence over developing worlds and powers on the rise. The next phase of Bolas's plan would bring things to a wider scale than ever, all starting with the creation of the Infinite Consortium. This was a mercantile organization that spanned between several planes, collecting rare and powerful items, and more importantly, exchanging information between different worlds. But regardless of what passed through the Consortium, everything was at Bolas's fingers. After leaving Amonkhet, Bolas would cross paths with Liliana Vess. She was old, tired, and desperate. Her body was withering away with age, and so she sought out the being that she believed to be the most powerful in all the planes, Nicol Bolas. They talked about how planeswalkers were once gods, immortals who could live freely on any plane. And as she thought back to her youth before the mending, Liliana would grow angry at what she had lost. She was once nearly omnipotent, and now she struggled to stand up straight. And so, here she was, begging the Elder Dragon for a way to escape death. While he didn't have the power to instill immortality himself, he explained that he could set up a deal between her and 4 demons. She would be able to offer them her soul in exchange for the youth and power that she had lost. However, they were not the only ones that she would be indebted to. Bolas too would demand payment, though he would not tell her his price at this moment. Liliana would leave under the impression that if she killed the demons who owned her soul, that she would be set free, but unbeknownst to her, in the event that she succeeded this task, she would become Bolas's servant. Once the deal was made, each of them went their separate ways. However, it left Bolas in thought. Despite still being magnitudes stronger than any other planeswalker, he was still a shell of his former greatness. He too wanted to regain what was lost, but he wouldn't be able to do it so easily as selling his soul to demons. And so he would travel to the plane of Alara, a world which had been sundered into 5 shards. Unbeknownst to the people of this plane, these shards were slowly moving towards each other and would eventually reunite in an event called the conflux, at which point an unbelievable maelstrom of mana would be created, which Bolas planned to harness and absorb so that he could reach godhood once again. To fulfill this goal, he began manipulating the people from each shard. Their chaos would fuel obelisks on their shards, and in doing so the conflux would end up becoming even more powerful than it was expected to be. To this end, Bolas would spread his corruption and his influence. First was Grixis, where power ruled supreme. Bolas would only need to demonstrate his own superiority in order to win over those on the shard, giving them an ultimatum of either following him or being killed. He would then create a massive army of the undead risen from the Cataract necropolis. The people of Esper were artificers specializing in Ethereum, so Bolas would convince them that their supply was running low and suggest that they might be able to find more if they invaded other shards. Jund was ruled by dragons and those who had power. The local tribes participated in life hunts, suicidal missions to kill greater and greater monsters, but their leader, Rakamar, was someone that Bolas took a special interest in. She was obsessed with strength, and so she was more than willing to accept his deal when he could offer her power in exchange for her servitude. Under his command, Raka began more and more dangerous life hunts and eventually suggested hunting the beasts of other shards in search of even greater prey. Naya was overrun with wildlife and behemoths, while their advanced Leonin tribe of the Nacatl was ruled by the scriptures of the Coil. Here, Bolas would manipulate the mind of a Leonin called Marissi, and used him as a pawn to twist the thoughts and hearts of those around him. He would ultimately create a divide which led to a civil war and destroyed the Empire and the Coil they worshipped. Finally, on Bant, Bolas convinced the people of the Skyward Eye to push their ideals of law and order to the extreme, leading to xenophobia and fear spreading across the shard, and the thought of stretching this new mindset to other shards as well. Now, back to the necropolis on Grixis. When the artificer Tezzeret's spark awakens, he is brought to the necropolis while Bolas is still putting things in motion, and immediately is thrust into a battle for survival against Bolas's monsters. However, he would soon be approached by the dragon himself, and would receive the traditional offer for power in exchange for servitude, and ultimately Tezzeret accepted. Together, he and Bolas would briefly travel to Ravnica and cross paths with Ral Zarek. At first, they offered to pay off his debt in exchange for his service, but he turned them down. So instead, Bolas shifted to another method. He took control of the Dimir thought stealer Milena and forced her to infiltrate Nissix, where she could plant a thought into Niv-Mizzet's mind. In particular, the idea was to have Ral create an interplanar beacon which could summon planeswalkers from all over the multiverse to fend off Bolas when he inevitably invaded Ravnica in the future. While Ral was not about to take orders from Bolas personally, he was more than willing to act for Niv-Mizzet in exchange for being made Guildmaster of the Izzet League. This was a great success. However, Bolas's new ally Tezzeret would end up betraying him and usurping rule over the consortium. When Bolas returned to take the organization back, Tezzeret would work with Jace to fend the dragon off. However, Bolas far outclassed both Jace and Tezzeret and quickly sent them both running. The two planeswalkers would ultimately turn against one another and dueled, leading to Jace crushing his opponent's mind. But this, again, almost entirely went in Bolas's favor. It was actually an idea that Liliana had run by Bolas to convince Tezzeret to turn against him and try to take over the consortium. She knew that he would need help and that he would likely turn to Jace for this help. However, with their differing worldviews, they would likely come to battle each other, and this was Bolas's opportunity. Sure, after the fight, Tezzeret essentially was just an empty husk, but he was an empty husk with a planeswalker spark that Bolas now had complete freedom to manipulate. And with that, everything was in place for the conflux. With years of manipulation and constantly nudging the people of Alara's shards towards violence, a plane-wide war emerged and awakened obelisks of mana on each shard, which expanded the maelstrom. In the conflict, Bolas was approached by a planeswalker named Sarkhan, and this man was immediately awestruck by the dragon. He even went so far as to say that it didn't seem like Bolas moved so much as the universe moved around him. Seeing such a great being before him, Sarkhan would swear his allegiance on the very spot, making a blood pact which gave him unimaginable power in exchange for his services in destroying the Esper obelisk. That said, this allegiance would become shaky when Bolas gifted Sarkhan with a flight of 5 dragons, one of which he had come across in the past, who was now a mindless shell of his former self. In the end, it wouldn't be Sarkhan who led to his downfall though, but instead it was Ajani. The Leonin found himself in conflict with Bolas, but he immediately recognized he didn't stand a chance in a fair fight. And so he summoned the essence of Bolas's own soul to fight for him, a perfect mirror who would battle Bolas to a standstill until they each landed a decisive bite on the other's neck and vanished in a flash of light. It was a truly Pyrrhic victory. On the one hand, Bolas had managed to harvest plenty of the Maelstrom's mana for himself, but on the other, he was still defeated and Ajani would become a permanent figure in his future plans. Bolas had been defeated for the second time in his life, and again it was by a mere mortal, something which truly began to eat at him. And this might be why he took a step back from things for a moment, and rather than going to Mirrodin himself, he would send Tezzeret to keep tabs on New Phyrexia. While he wasn't expected to actually stop the Phyrexian uprising, it was Tezzeret's job to delay things as much as possible while reporting everything he saw and heard to Bolas. The dragon believed that the Phyrexians were a chaotic plague, and while they hadn't come into contact yet, they would be destined to if both forces kept expanding their own influences. This is why he wanted Tezzeret to ensure that they couldn't travel between planes, and once this mission was complete, he would return to his master once again. But New Phyrexia wasn't the only plane with powerful entities on it. Zendikar had also piqued Bolas's interest. There, he began to study the Eye of Ugin, the prison created by his brother to steal away the Eldrazi Titans. In this, Bolas found infinite potential, but he couldn't simply unleash them himself. That would leave him too involved and potentially in harm's way. So instead, he would eventually send Sarkhan to guard the Eye. At least this is what he told Sarkhan. In actuality, he was setting the stage for the Planeswalker to open the Eye himself. In his last encounter with Ugin, Bolas had learned all about the Eldrazi and the seal which held them at bay, which importantly meant that he knew to unlock it, you would need 3 Planeswalkers and Ugin's Ghost Flame to be present before the Eye. Naturally, Sarkhan would be the first. Second was Chandra Nalaar, who Bolas had set on a path to discover the Ghost Flame scroll. This would make her curious enough to eventually follow it back to its point of origin on Zendikar. And finally, Bolas would nudge Jace Beleren towards Zendikar as well. He, Chandra, and Sarkhan would come into contact when they convened at the Eye, and it would only be a matter of time before Chandra was backed into a corner by Sarkhan's dragon form and forced to use a Ghostfire spell. And suddenly, all the necessary components were present, and the Titans were unleashed. But how does this actually benefit Bolas? Well, he had learned of an ancient and powerful spell, the Elder Spell, which had the potential to ascend him to godhood once again. However, it required the sacrifice of many Planeswalker sparks, so he had hoped that the Titan's rampage would lure in other Planeswalkers, and then he could harvest their sparks. But this plan ultimately failed. In fact, it backfired. The Planeswalkers would form the Gatewatch together and defeat Ulamog and Kozilek on Zendikar before going to Innistrad, where they would once again steal away Emrakul. What was once an opportunity for Bolas to grow stronger than ever had instead resulted in an alliance of the only beings who could stand to oppose him. However, the Eldrazi were not the only scheme he was preparing, and on both Kaladesh and Amonkhet, things were going exactly as he planned. Bolas was also making steps to attain the Immortal Sun, but because the Great Mending sealed off interplanetary travel of that scale, he would need to find a new path to retrieve it. Luckily, on Kaladesh, Tezzeret learned of an artificer who had completed a device called the Planar Bridge, which he could fuse with his own body, thus bypassing any limitations that might have stopped him from bringing the Planar Bridge with him. Meanwhile, on Amonkhet, a seeming utopia had sprouted. The worthy dead had picked up all of the day-to-day tasks in the 6 decades since Bolas had left. They do all the farming, the building, the teaching, and even embalm other mummies. Meanwhile, all the living have to do is train and become stronger. This skill and strength in turn would be preserved when they died. Essentially, it was a harmonious and peaceful engine of war, and every cog in the machine knew only to worship Bolas as their god pharaoh. But to truly show their devotion, the people of Amonkhet had to pass the trials of the gods, ensuring only the strongest and most capable survived. But all was not as it seemed, and those who did pass were rewarded by promptly being killed and turned into Eternals. They were then covered in Lazotep armor and forced to enter Bolas's great army. With Bolas's arrival, the prophecies within the Hour of Accounting began occurring one after another, but again, not in the way that the people of Amonkhet had understood them. The Hour of Revelation promised to open the gate to the afterlife for all who served Bolas, but as the gate opened, the demon Razakhet emerged and flooded their rivers with blood. The Hour of Glory was supposed to be a time of judgment. However, instead, the Scorpion God resurfaced and killed all others that it deemed unworthy of the God Pharaoh's gift. The Hour of Promise was to be a time where Nicol Bolas returned and tore down Hakma's barrier, as the city would no longer need to be protected from the world around them. However, as the barrier fell, the Locust God emerged, and the desert completely overwhelmed Hekma under his charge. And finally, the Hour of Eternity was supposed to be a time where all those who worshipped Bolas would get to live in peace and harmony forever. However, instead the Scarab God arose, and the Eternal Army was sent out to exterminate all who had not yet passed the trials of the gods. But beyond all of that, there was still one final hour which had not been accounted for in the prophecies. The Hour of Devastation. Bolas himself would appear before the Gatewatch and destroy them. To this point, Amonkhet was his. But a few days prior to his arrival on the plane, the Gatewatch had discovered his ever-growing army of Eternals and came to put a stop to his tyranny. But to say that they were not prepared is an understatement. Chandra's flames, Nissa's vines, and Liliana's zombies were completely ineffective, and Gideon was kept at bay as Bolas tossed him around Noctimoon with his tail. Jace was really the only interesting opponent for Bolas, and so he would allow the Planeswalker to enter his mind, but ultimately he was crushed just like all the others. However, something strange happened as Jace came into contact with the dragon. His mind wiped itself clear, and just before he was killed, he planeswalked away to Ixalan. With Jace gone, Bolas was essentially free to go at his own pace. First, he turned to Liliana and offered to teach her about the Chain Veil if she retreated, a method of maintaining her power without the need for the demon contract. And of course, she agreed. With Chandra, he was more direct. He pinned her under his claw and pressed until he felt her ribs cracked and began laughing at the foolishness of a pyromancer going after a dragon. Utterly defeated, she too left the plane. He then used his command over the plane to turn Nissa's tie to the land against her, flooding her with necrotic magic and forcing her to planeswalk away as well. That only left Gideon, but even his invulnerability was no match for the dragon's magic, which pierced right through it, and in the end, Gideon fled like all the rest. As for Amonkhet's own forces, only 2 of the original gods remained, Bontu and Hazaret. Even this was going as Bolas planned though, as Bontu was already working for Bolas. He had ordered the god to execute her sister, and in a saddened shock, Hazaret asked why she would turn against her own world, but Bontu simply responded, "Bolas is the world," before finishing off the last of her siblings. She then turned to Bolas for her reward, vowing to serve the god pharaoh, but her value had run dry to him, so he laughed and told her that she could serve him in death instead. Bontu's only reward would be a brutal death, as hordes of the undead took her life and she was reborn as one of Bolas's Eternals. He had won, and was now closer than ever to regaining the power which had been stolen from him so very long ago. But his victories didn't stop there. While Bolas battled the Gatewatch, his agent Vraska was on Ixalan and searching for the Immortal Sun. He had promised to make her a guild mage in Ravnica if she could find the artifact for him, and once she did, she was to reach out to Tezzeret, who would come and take the sun away in his planar bridge. This went flawlessly. Shortly after the conflict, Gideon and Liliana would hunt down the demon lord Belzenlock, the last of the surviving demons that she had made a contract with. However, in killing this demon, she had played into Bolas's hand yet again. Sure, she had the chain veil, so she didn't have any need for the demons anymore, but with none of them remaining, Liliana's soul would from here on belong to the one who had brokered the deal for her in the first place, Nicol Bolas. And with that, she is forced into servitude, as any action of defiance would lead to her immediate death. From here, Ravnica would be Bolas's next target, and by now, his claws had already dug into it. Bolas had gained influence over 5 planeswalkers, and in turn, each had gained control of a guild. Vraska ruled the Golgari, Dovin Bond the Azorius, Ralzeric had the Izzet League, Kaya took control of the Orzhov, and finally, Domri Raid led the Gruul. Bolas also controlled Glademaster Garo of the Selesnya, leaving him with influence over 6 of the 10 guilds of Ravnica. And as his control continued to solidify, Tezzeret used his planar bridge to open a portal to Amonkhet, which would allow thousands upon thousands of Eternals to march through. And each of them would be placed under the control of Bolas's Dread Horde general, Liliana. Finally, it was time for Bolas himself to make an appearance on the plane and put things into motion. And all of that started with Niv-Mizzet. The two dragons fought a ferocious battle with unbelievable magic. Bolas was even surprised to find that his mind-shattering touch was ineffective against his enemy. But as the battle continued, Niv felt himself falling behind. So as a last-ditch effort, he dropped a gigantic chunk of the city on his enemy, but it just wasn't enough. Bolas rose in a dark sphere of death and destruction, and the great Niv-Mizzet looked up in fear for the first time in his life, as Bolas launched his final attack, leaving nothing but charred remains of his enemy. With that, the final stage of Bolas's plan could be set into motion. The interplanar beacon that Bolas had Ralzeric create was activated, and dozens of planeswalkers were lured in and trapped within the Immortal Sun. The cage meant to hold Bolas was now his greatest asset. With all of these planeswalkers present, Bolas cast the Elder Spell, allowing his Eternals to harvest planeswalkers' sparks to grant himself ultimate power and godhood. All his Dread Horde had to do was get a hold of a planeswalker and they could siphon their sparks out, empowering Bolas even further. However, the Horde's general had a change of heart. She witnessed a young girl try to save her brother from a collapsing wall, only for both of them to die in the process. A scene which was a brutal reminder of the traumatic moment which triggered her own spark to ignite all those years ago. And seeing what she was doing at Bolas's command, Liliana just couldn't keep going. She turned the Horde against the dragon, stopping their attack on Gideon in the process, saving his life, and ultimately deciding to sacrifice her own. Now, Bolas is more in the business of doing the betraying rather than being betrayed, and so he invoked the magic in her contract. The necromancer started to disintegrate. However, before she fully faded, Gideon used his magic to take on the ill effects of Liliana's contract for himself. Her brave act of defiance against Bolas would not be punished, and he would allow her to go on living. And this is where the tides of battle completely shifted. Liliana still held control of the Dread Horde and commanded the Eternals that used to be Oketra and Bontu to attack Bolas. As he defended himself from these former gods, Niv-Mizzet rose once again and stabbed Bolas in the back with Hazaret's spear. Yes, he literally just died. I will come back to it in a second, but for now it is important to know that this weapon had been given to Hazaret by Bolas himself and contained within it a fragment of his own essence. This allowed the weapon to injure him even in this godly state. Bolas roared in pain, still besieged by the eternal gods. He managed to obliterate Oketra, but in doing so opened himself up to Bontu, allowing her to bite down on him and deal incredible damage. But more importantly, in betraying Bontu in Amonkhet, Bolas enabled this attack to be his undoing. Bontu was an Eternal, and like all the other Eternals in the Horde, she was under the effects of the Elder spell, which means when she clutched down on the dragon, all of his sparks were siphoned out of his body. That includes all the sparks he had stolen, as well as his own. However, Bontu's body was not prepared to contain all of this power, and so she would burst into countless shards. Her sacrifice would not be in vain though, as Bolas was left near powerless and on the verge of death. He was completely open for the planeswalkers to attack him. However, as they did, Ugin reached out to Jace telepathically and explained that they must not kill him.
Okay, I know you said he was dead. You cannot bring him back a second time.
Well, turns out they can. Both Ugin and his brother had cheated death in the past by becoming spirits, and so Ugin knew that the best way to guarantee Bolas was neutralized was to imprison him, while at the same time tricking the multiverse into believing he had been killed. Bolas might have had contingencies for being killed, but his arrogance would never have planned for his own capture. After all, surely no one would allow for the great and powerful God Pharaoh to survive given the chance to kill him. Because of this, Ugin wanted Jace to create an illusion of Bolas's death, something to convince everyone who witnessed it, Bolas's agents included, that he died here. This way, even if they worked towards resurrecting him, there would be nothing to revive. While everyone was distracted by this illusion, Ugin himself would planeswalk into Ravnica and steal his brother away. He wrapped Bolas under his wings and traveled through the blind eternities to the meditation realm. However, without a spark of his own, this was brutal for Bolas. His scales would be ripped off, and he'd be so wounded from the experience that he lost consciousness for weeks, though recovery would take months to really begin. When he finally woke up, Bolas found himself unable to planeswalk, or even perform any kind of magic at all. But the worst torment that he would face here was being forced to listen to Ugin explain how he had been outmaneuvered by his brother. As it turns out, Sarkhan was sent back in time to just before Ugin and Bolas fought, and used a Hedron to capture some of Ugin's essence. These are the same ones that Bolas found when he visited his brother's grave, but didn't have time to examine as he was scared off the plane. Sarkhan would then use this essence to create the Crucible of the Spirit Dragon, effectively acting like a cocoon for Ugin to rest in until way later when Sorin woke him because of the Eldrazi awakening. Naturally, Ugin would start keeping tabs on his brother once he woke up. For example, he was the reason that Jace's mind was wiped during the Battle of the Gatewatch in Amonkhet, and subsequently he is why Jace went to Ixalan. And finally, Ugin had made a plan with Niv-Mizzet so that in the event that he was killed by Bolas, Niv-Mizzet's mind and soul could be housed in a device that Sarkhan would bring to the meditation realm, where he would perform a ritual to revive the dragon. At the same time, Ugin would also send Sarkhan to Amonkhet to retrieve Hazaret's spear. These would be all the pieces of the puzzle he would need to connect to ensure his brother's defeat. And all of that was only possible because of Bolas's pride and vanity. Bolas was quite literally wearing his own weakness as a crown. The spirit gem which he donned so proudly as a symbol of his own greatness was a part of his brother's soul, and because Bolas needed to show off that he had defeated his brother by wearing that gem, Ugin was able to see every step and mistake that his brother would ever make. But the embarrassment at Ugin's hands would not end there. He told Bolas that he had stripped him of both of his names to ensure that he could never be summoned again. And finally, Ugin told his brother that he had expanded himself to cover the entirety of the meditation realm so that no one would ever be able to come and save him. This place would be a prison for both of them, and Ugin would keep watch until his twin's mortal life came to a natural end, no matter how many thousands of years that might take. Throughout his life, the dragon born with half a name would do anything to exceed the limitations that others had placed on him. Anything to show his own greatness. It's why Nicol felt the need to add Bolas to his name. After all, a dragon is only complete if they had two. His brother told him so. And this could be the reason that he spent the rest of his life collecting titles. the second sun, the forever serpent, the horned one, dragon god, god emperor of Madara, god pharaoh of Amonkhet. However, despite all of his efforts, each of these would be stripped away from him. And as of right now, he is sitting in the meditation realm, nameless, imprisoned, and just like me, out of mana.